What is the Pentateuch? The first 5 books of the Old Testament, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, are called the Pentateuch. It is derived from the Greek word Pentateuchos. That means 5-volume work or 5-fold book. Jews call these 5 books Torah, which is often rendered as law in English, as it is called nomos in Greek in the New Testament. The Hebrew word Torah, conventionally translated as law, is much broader idea than its English translation conveys. Torah derives from the verb yara, means to teach or instruct. So we would be wiser to render Torah as instruction rather than law. Then, what is the Pentateuch about? The Pentateuch opens with the book of beginnings. Genesis comes from a Greek word meaning origins. As the table indicates, Genesis divides into 2 sections. The first one, chapters 1 to 11. It focuses on primeval history. And the second section, chapters 12 to 50, it focuses on patriarchal history. Genesis chapter 1 to 11 presents a problem. God created a universe that he evaluated as good at every phase of his creation. But humanity ruined what he accomplished. After Adam and Eve brought sin into the world in Genesis 3, the effects of sin were evident in every aspect of God's creation and became progressively worse. God chose a single man and his family as the solution to the sin problem in the world. Genesis chapter 12 to 50 is the story of Abraham, his family, and their journey of faith. It demonstrates the origin of God's redemption plan for the world. To sum up, Genesis tells of the beginnings of the world and of God's people. At the conclusion of Genesis, God miraculously delivered his people from a famine through Joseph, and they lived peacefully in Egypt. But many years later, the Egyptians oppressed the Israelites and forced them into slavery. Exodus relates the preparation and call of Moses and his role in leading the Israelites out of Egypt. Exodus means departure. The book of Exodus also describes God's new binding relationship, that is, a covenant relationship with his people, through the law giving and the tabernacle building. As the table shows, Exodus chapter 1 to 18 gives an account of God's liberating the Israelites from Egypt. Then Exodus chapter 19 to 24 introduces the details of law giving. Then Exodus 25 to 40 focuses on the tabernacle. The golden calf event is sandwiched between the instructions to build the tabernacle and the construction of it. The third book of the Pentateuch is Leviticus, which is related to the sons of Levi or priests. The theme of holiness runs through the whole book. It calls God's people to ritual and moral purity. Leviticus focuses on how the people can maintain the covenant relationship with God. It instructs the priests in how to offer appropriate sacrifice to God. This book is thus devoted to preserving Israel's holy moral character as an aid to worship and enjoyment of the Lord and his blessings. As the table shows, Leviticus chapter 1 to 7 introduces the laws on sacrifice. Then Leviticus chapter 8 to 10 brings out the institution of the priesthood. Then Leviticus chapter 11 to 15 focuses on the treatment of uncleanness. Leviticus 16 is the center of the book, giving instructions about the Day of Atonement. Apart from ritual holiness, the final section incorporates moral holiness in the book of Leviticus. Leviticus chapter 17 to 27 expresses how the Israelites reflect God's holiness by living out life practically. Regarding the fourth book of the Pentateuch, a series of rebellious events run through the book of Numbers. The book opens with elaborate preparation for leaving Mount Sinai, where the covenant was established. The bad report from the 10 spies returning from Canaan leads to the reluctance of the Israelites to enter the promised land. Israelites' disobedience is so costly that God did not permit his people to enter the promised land immediately. Numbers relates how God's people tragically wandered in the desert for 40 years. This book shows how the Israelites moved from Sinai to Kadesh and Moab, as indicated in the diagram. The book title Numbers comes from the Septuagint due to the two censuses in chapters 1 and 26. The first census in chapter 1 aims at counting the number of men who can enter the promised land to fight, whereas the second census in chapter 26 aims to count the number of people in order to allocate the land among the 12 tribes when they enter the promised land. Deuteronomy is the final book of the Pentateuch. It is a series of Moses' farewell sermons on the plains of Moab across the Jordan River from the promised land. Moses addresses God's people and prepares them for their entrance into Canaan. He restates the law of the covenant. That is why the book is named Deuteronomy, which means second law. Moses warns them against turning from God to worship other deities. This book aims to reestablish the covenant between God and his people. The imminence of Moses' death hangs over the whole book, giving his speeches a peculiar sense of urgency and poignancy. As the diagram indicates, the book of Deuteronomy contains 3 sermons, and finally, the epilogue, which focuses on Moses' last days. We may summarize the Pentateuch as follows. Genesis is a book of origins, which describes the beginning of the universe and the origins of God's people. Exodus traces the salvation of his people, who are helpless to save themselves. Leviticus calls for holiness as the only natural lifestyle for the Israelites, and as the only possible response to God's grace. Numbers is a book of wanderings in which God's people suffer the consequences of their unbelief. But the story ends on a positive note when Deuteronomy presents a program for renewal.